Hello everybody and welcome to a very special video. With this video, I'm starting a new series. The name of the series is Simplified Openings. For those who know me from Chessable will probably recognize where the name comes from. It comes from my best-selling Chessable courses having the name Simplified in the title. This, I would like to say, trademark approach that I introduced first on Chessable, the simplified approach, turned out to be very successful simply because I have managed to, in a way, find the magic formula, if you will, of providing what most of the people need. And this is practical solutions to opening problems. So in this video series, this is exactly what I will try to do. I will share with you my opening discoveries where I have managed to find, let's call them shortcuts, which basically manage to circumvent well-established theory while at the same time still providing playable positions. So in this first video of the series of simplified openings, we will take a look at one of the oldest openings in chess, the Queen's Gambit Accepted. As one of the oldest and also most respectable openings, the Queen's Gambit Accepted has developed quite a lot of theory over the, let's not even say years, but rather centuries of implementation. So what has changed lately is that some new ideas have started to appear, and coupled with my own discoveries in this opening, well, you get the result, this video, which I also have to add was inspired by some social media posts by Nikolaos Ntirlis, a very prominent correspondence player and a very good theoretical analyst. So without further ado, I will just now show you my ideas in the Queen's Gambit Accepted, and as you will see at the end of the video, you will basically need to know only a few lines to learn in order to play this opening, and probably it will take you less than 10 minutes to do so. So let's move on. After the moves d4, d5, c4, d takes c4, we arrive at the Queen's Gambit Accepted. Now, the very good aspect of the Queen's Gambit Accepted is that white generally has only two main lines against it. These two main lines are the moves e4, which is the most critical one because white establishes a strong pawn center, and the other move is the move knight f3. White can also start with e3, but these lines, as we shall see, transpose one to another and do not have any independent value. So there is knight f3 and there is e4. Basically, that's all you need to learn. So first and foremost, it's very important to note that the Queen's Gambit Accepted severely limits white's choices. So after d takes c4, just to show you the transposition, if white starts with e3, this will transpose to the lines that we will look at after knight f3 later on, after the move c5, bishop c4, cd, ed, e6, knight f3, and we actually have a transposition to the lines after knight f3. So we will start our explorations with the move knight f3. And here the first surprise, and in fact the whole repertoire against in the Queen's Gambit Accepted is based actually on the third move c5. The traditional main moves here have been knight f6 or e6 or a6, all likely leading to the main lines, but the late discoveries, well, recently played games, have actually shown that the move c5 is pretty viable. Even more so, as the name of the series suggests, it simplifies black's task a lot because it circumvents all these main lines that have developed over the years. Now after c5, white has actually two critical lines, and these are the moves e3 and the move d5. So as I mentioned, as you can see in the name of the video, I said that there are only 3 lines you need to know in the Queen's Gambit decline. These are 2 of them. So these are 2, and there is only 1 critical line after White's move, third move e4, and that's pretty much all you need to know in order to play the opening. With this being said, a quick note that the move e4 here is really harmless, because after simply c takes d4, now White should take with the queen, because taking with the knight is worse. Knight f6 attacks the pawn on e4, knight c3, e5, and already black is even slightly better, because the queens will be exchanged. White still needs to need time to take on c4. The knight has no real good squares to go to, so this is already not that great for White. Therefore, after cd4, queen d4 is played, but the endgame after queen d4, knight d4, and now bishop d7, followed by knight c6 is really a very harmless endgame from black's point of view. Therefore, e4 is rarely played. Now we turn our attention to the more critical ones. Yeah, so e3. Now c takes d4, and now bishop takes c4. Taking e d4 is possible and will likely transpose after e6, bishop c4, even though if black is more, let's say, ambitious, can try to cling on to that pawn with bishop e6. This has some theory involved, but from a practical perspective, black can just transpose to the lines we're going to take a look at. Again, exchanging queens is just harmless takes on d4, bishop d7, knight c6, and it's really very simple for black. So bishop c4 is the move, and now the main move for black here for a very long time has been the move queen c7. Note that taking on e3 would be pretty horrible because of this trick bishop f7. It's a check, and black loses the queen. So that's the idea behind bishop c4. And queen c7 has been aimed against this, to counter-attacking the bishop and basically winning a pawn. In case of bishop b3, d takes e3, and there is quite some theory developed here. But this is not what I'm going to recommend, even though here I would like to note one of the fresh ideas in this variation, and that is the move g6. And some of the fresh ideas in the Queen's Gambit Accepted that actually led me to exploration of these lines were the games of Alexander Pretke, currently Serbian Grandmaster, formerly Russian Grandmaster. He really had some interesting ideas in the Queen's Gambit Accepted, and they served as the starting point of my explorations. So this is something that you can explore. The game is Livaich against Pretke, played in this year to 2024. So, but this is not what I'm going to recommend. In fact, I will recommend a simpler approach, and starts with a very simple move e6, and after ed4. Now, not the usual development with knight f6, bishop e7, which is somewhat suboptimal for black, because we are getting the lines from the Queen's Gambit Accepted normal, yeah? But with cd4, ed4 having been played too early from by black. And this is, like I said, suboptimal for black. So instead of this, actually, I would recommend a very rare setup and quite viable one, also a bit unusual, which I would expect to have some surprise value. And it starts with the move bishop d6. After short castle, knight e7. So this is the setup that is actually very interesting. And so instead of knight f6, bishop e7, we have bishop d6 and knight e7. And it's a very interesting setup. Let's say now something like knight c3, short castle. And we have more or less the starting position here, where we have a position with an isolated queen's pawn on d4, with black's somewhat peculiar development of the pieces. What's interesting here is that the knight on e7 is flexible. It can go to g6, it can go to f5, but the downside is that the knight not being on f6 means that the king side can be a bit vulnerable, especially the h7 pawn. So a very important move for black in these positions is the move actually h6, covering the g5 square, so there will be no knight g5 ideas. And also the fact that after something like queen d3, bishop c2, there are no mates here because the knight can maneuver to g6 and f8, as we shall soon see. So let's just to show you a few lines how the game can develop. There are not that many games here, and this is good for exploration. So just to show you the dangers, let's just say bishop d2. Now black can play h6 and should play h6, even though immediately it's not strictly necessary. So black can start with bishop d7. This is one of the ideas for black in this variation, activating the bishop on the long diagonal. Bishop d7, bishop c6. But after rook e1, already it is high time to play the move h6, because continuing with bishop c6 shows the dangers that black faces, and they start with the move knight g5. And all of a sudden there is a very strong attack, not only queen h5 and attacking h7, but also there are sacrifices on e6. So to illustrate, h6, knight takes e6, f6, rook e6, threatening a discovered check, king h8, queen h5, and already black is just dead lost, because catastrophe is happening on h6 and it's game over. But after h6, black is perfectly fine, and he will continue with bishop c6 and everything is fine. So for example, even d5 playing in the center, e5, knight e5, knight e5, bishop d5, bishop c6, bishop b3, and now an only move for black, not knight d7, because they may allow some bishop h6 and the bishop on this, bishop h6, and the bishop on d6 is hanging, but knight a6, and knight is coming to c5, and it's an equal position without problems for black. So this is one possible line. There are others. For example, let's say rook e1, h6. Yeah, it's an important move to make. Let's say knight e5 now, knight bc6, challenging the knight on e5, knight takes c6, and now very important move, bc6. Another important idea in these IQP positions is taking with the pawn on c6, with the idea of controlling the d5 square in front of the IQP. And after knight e4, another important idea, the move a5, which allows for the activation of the passive light squared bishop. Again, black doesn't have problems here. And let's explore, let's say, bishop d3, already introducing some threats on the diagonal, h6, the move we want to make. Let's say bishop c2. There are other lines, you can explore this, for example, queen e2. And now there is knight bc6, there is also bishop d7, knight e5, bishop c6 that I mentioned, which also works nicely. There are some sharp lines, and again, these lines should be explored, but generally they are perfectly fine for black. So I mentioned bishop c2, now knight bc6. There is also bishop d7, which is also perfectly fine, yeah, with the idea of bishop c6. Let's say queen d3, threatening mate, knight g6, h4, and now f5. This is a standard way of shutting the b1 h7 diagonal, and now at the same time this pawn is hanging on h4, so it's kind of a pretty unclear position, but objectively black is doing fine. An alternative is knight bc6, threatening some knight b4, which would attack the bishop on c2, or possibly a queen on d3 after let's say queen d3, knight g6, and the knight b4 is threatened, so a3, b6. Yeah, now this is the way to activate the bishop, going to b7. Let's say queen d3 again, threatening mate, knight g6, h4, and now not f5. Well, even though I guess it's possible, but since the bishop is going to go to b7, that means that after f5 the pawn on e6 would be vulnerable. So there is another way to deal with the threat of h5, which is more compact one. Now rook e8. Now the rook is covering the pawn, so f5 may become possible in the future, especially after h5, knight f8, queen e4, hitting the knight on c6, bishop b7, defending it, continuing development, bishop queen g4, threatening bishop h6 in view of the pin, and now f5. So now the pawn on e6 is well defended, so f5 works again, shutting the bishop on c2, and after queen h3, queen f6, for example, yeah, attacking the pawn on d4, let's say bishop e3, rook ac8, and black has finished development with a pretty complex middle game position. That queen is out of play, and black has very good development, no threats against the king. So this setup is really very interesting and somewhat original, I would say. Not many games in it, and I would also expect to have a surprise value in a practical game. So this is the line with the bishop c 4 and e3. So e3, cd4, bishop c4, e6, yeah, and then bishop d6, knight e7. Now we can, that's one line you need to know, okay? So the other one is d5. d5 and now e6, immediately challenging the pawn on d5. And now the move e4 is played. Because knight c3, again, allows black very easy play. As you will see, these lines are very, very easy to play because the position simplifies in the center very quickly, and black's pieces obtain very good squares to develop. So take on d5 naturally, yeah. Now if knight d5, knight e7, immediately challenging the knight. Let's say e4, knight d5, e5, bishop d6, and that's pretty much all you need to do. Yeah? Short castle, maybe knight d7, knight f6, bishop f5. Just the pieces are coming out very easily. And in case of queen d5, knight d5, the threat is to give check on c7, bishop d6, defending it. And now there is some theory involved here. It has been played quite a bit, but the endgame is very harmless for black. So just to give you an illustrative line, let's say e4, knight f6 is good, challenging the knight and attacking the pawn. And the point is that knight f6, gf6 is very comfortable for black. The double pawns, especially the one on f6, effectively stop white from using this pawn majority, because the pawn f6 is controlling the e5 square, and bishop c4, bishop e6, bishop e6, f takes e6 was completely equal in the game Stopa Pretke. Again, a game by Pretke, which played on the internet, which black even went on to win this endgame. He continued with knight c6, long castle, and well, then just obtained control over the d file, and his majority was the more useful one. So that's the line with e4. Knight d2 is considered to be more precise. Yeah. Knight c6, simple development. Knight c4, attacking the bishop, and now the bishop draws back to b8. This is only temporary, as the bishop will get back into the game. Now what black would like to do is to challenge the knight on d5 by playing knight g7, bishop e6. Once the knight is no longer on d5, the bishop can get back into the game. So a sample line, let's say e4, knight d4. Black also gets a very strong outpost, bishop d3 and knight e7, challenging the knight. Already black is doing quite all right. So let's say bishop e3, this is the most critical move, and now black is spoiled for choice. There is bishop e6, knight e7, king e7, which is perfectly fine. After bishop, knight a5, even the simple bishop c8 is fine. So there is also more complex, let's say bishop c7, sacrificing a pawn for activity after rook b8 and so forth. So that's one idea. Another idea is just to take the knight e5, e5 and castle, long castle b6. Yeah, so black is again fine. And probably the simplest is to go knight ec6 to ignore the knight on d5 and play to support the knight on d4. So let's say rook c1, short castle, and let's say knight d2, attacking the pawn on c5, but now the bishop comes back. Yeah? And then the other bishop comes, f5 is an idea for black. So really with excellent pieces in the center, it's easy to play the endgame. So this line, even though it has been played, it's not really critical for black. But it also has to be said that the other line, which is in this case e4, also is not very critical for black. Black also gets very easy play, e5, e5. Now bishop d6, bishop c4, and knight f6. And pay attention to this position, okay? Because we will get a very similar one in the line after third move e4. But in that position, this knight on f3 will be on g1, and the knight on b1 will be on c3. So this subtle difference, or not that subtle if you will, in the position will make black's position a bit more difficult to play in that line. So with the knight on c3, white will have ideas based on knight b5, and black will be forced to spend a move on the move a6. And this will make it a bit more problematic for black. We will take a look at that via the third move e4. With that in mind, that simply means that the lines with the knight on f3 instead of knight c3 are just much easier for black, as you will see. Now, short castle is what white should try, because the endgame after queen e2, queen e7, king e7 is really so easy. Knight c3, now a6, threatening b5, so a4, and now rook e8, castles, knight b7, and it's really easy. The king drops back to f8. The pawn on d5 is passed pawn, but it's also an isolated one. It's not going anywhere because it's well blockaded, and white and black can try to activate the queenside majority. For example, if a5, b5 already, and if a b6, knight b6, and the knight is already very active, hitting that pawn on d5, and really no problems for black whatsoever. So that's why short castle, and now white can try several ways how to develop or where to put the pieces, but from black's perspective, really everything is so easy, because bishop is coming to f5, knight is coming to d7, and that's pretty much all you need to know. So there was a game, for example, between Tang and Magnus Carlsen played online, and I'll show you that one. For example, knight c3 played by Tang. Now again, black is spoiled for choice. Can go bishop g4, which is another idea you should know in this position. h3, take on f3, and knight b7. And really, by exchanging that knight on f3, black established further control over the dark squares, because the knight no longer controls e5. There is also the move bishop f5. Carlsen played h6 to stop bishop g5. But even allowing bishop g5, just while we are at it, I can just show you bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, bishop f5, for example, knight c3, and knight b7. So the pin is really of little consequence, because the queen can easily move from d8, and the knights are connected, so this doesn't affect black whatsoever. So knight c3 by Tang, h6, h3, stopping bishop g4, and now rook e8. Bishop f5 is also possible, yeah? Bishop e3, bishop f5, rook e1, knight b7, and this is the ideal development that black is looking to achieve. Knight can come to e5, a6, b5 can be an idea, and very, very good middle game position for black already. The game was played online, so the players committed some inaccuracies later on, but from the opening perspective, it's already clear that black is doing quite all right. So that's the second line you need to know. And to sum up, after knight f3 or e3, there are two lines you need to remember after c5. One is the IQP line after e3, cd, bishop c4, e6, followed by bishop d6 and knight e7. And the other one is the d5, e6. And now with the sub-variation of knight c3, d5, and the endgame that we saw, or e4, ed, bishop d6, bishop c4, knight f6, followed by castle, and easy play for black. So that's pretty much wraps up one of white's moves, knight f3. Now let's move on to the other move, e4. So e4, and now again the move c5. Currently, there is a lot of theoretical battles raging around the move b5. The historically main moves had been knight f6, and e5, and knight c6. c5 was popular in the early 90s, but then kind of drifted away from the limelight, and I think just recently this has kind of obtained a bit of a more attention. And what attracted me to the move was the actual similarity of the position that I mentioned that you should pay attention to a bit earlier, and the ones we are getting in the main line here. So from a practical perspective, it's very good, because you're getting this very similar, actually the same pawn structure, but a very similar position, with some subtleties that the unprepared player would likely fail to notice, and this automatically gives black easy play. So let's see what's happening. So d5, now e6, playing exactly the same way. knight c3, or bishop c4, knight f6, knight c3, which ed5, which leads to the same. So knight c3, knight f6, bishop c4, ed5. And now white can take with bishop, knight, or pawn. Even though the pawn capture is the most critical one, I'll quickly give you a roundup of the others as well, just to be prepared. So knight d5 is the least critical. Knight takes on d5, bishop d5, and bishop e7. And it's really very easy. Short castle, then there are ideas like knight c6 and bishop e6. There is also knight a6, knight b4, targeting the bishop on d5. This is not very critical. So just to give you an idea, knight e2, this is considered more precise than knight f3 because the knight goes to c3 to support the bishop on d5, castles, castles. And now you have a choice. If you want to keep the game more complex, you can go knight a6, and after knight c3 go knight b4. So the knight is quite active in targeting this bishop on d5, and after bishop f4, bishop f6. Don't forget that black also has a very good outpost on d4. So this is one way. The simpler way is to go knight c6. Much more natural, developing the knight on c6, targeting that d4 outpost, especially if white plays knight c3, so bishop e6, yeah, and already it's very, development is finished. Black controls the d4 outpost, let's say bishop e3, and now either queen b6 or queen d6 if you want, and then rook a d8, bishop f6, and then landing a piece on d4. Straightforward, easy play, nothing to worry about. Knight c6 allows the exchange of on c6, but the endgame is actually very good for black. Take on d1 and take on c6. And why black has a good endgame? Because even though there are double pawns on the c file, there is also a pair of bishops, and there is also counterplay on against white's queen side. So two ideas: bishop f4, for example, stops black from using the b file by controlling the b square, the b8 square, but now bishop a6 attacking the knight, knight c3, and rook f d8. And now we see again the importance of the outpost on d4. So that's one idea. Or alternatively, bishop e3, white tries to play against the pawn on c5, but now the b file comes to the fore. Rook b8, b3, and a5, introducing a4, bishop a6, and again it's clear that black has very good counterplay here. So that's the line with knight takes d5. Bishop d5 is a bit more, let's say, serious, but again, I actually present this line because I've discovered an amazing line here for both sides, and I will demonstrate it, even though it's not really necessary to remember it or even know it, because I will show you the simpler solution later on after I show you this amazing line, because I just can't resist showing it. So knight takes d5 is the most natural move, even though, as you will see, the alternative bishop d6 is much simpler. So knight d5, now ed5. If knight d5, bishop d6, just it's too easy. ed5, bishop d6, yeah, looks so far so good. Queen e2 check, queen e7, and now knight b5. If you remember, I mentioned this very important motif, and that's why having a knight on c3 rather than on f3 works in white's favor, thanks to this idea of knight b5. And it appears pretty bad for black already, because there is a threat against the bishop, and the bishop goes, there is knight c7. But what follows is simply amazing. Black goes castles and just gives up a rook. Take on e7, bishop e7, knight c7. It looks that it's just resignable, right? But just observe what happens. Knight a6, developing, giving up the rook, and now knight b4. So all of a sudden turns out that black has very strong counterplay. There is the threat of knight c2. And now what white should do is to actually allow knight c2 with a very sharp position, because preventing it, let's say king d1, knight d5, stops the knight from escaping by controlling the c7 square. Let's say knight e2, rook d8, threatening some discovered checks, bishop d2, bishop f5, and this is actually equal. Black gets the knight, has a pawn for the exchange, and a fantastic activity of the pieces. Yeah, so the bishops are amazing, the king is stuck in the center. Black has really no problems in this endgame. So white should actually go knight c7, and now I'll just give you the crazy line. Knight c2 check, king d1, knight a1, knight f3, bishop f5, trying to extract the knight, rook e1, hitting the bishop on e7, bishop f6, rook e2, preventing the knight from escaping, bishop d3 now, hitting the rook, rook d2, c4. It's a very strange position. The knight is stuck in the corner, but white can't get to it. So d6, rook d8, knight d5, going after this bishop, rook d6, takes on f6, takes on f6, and now b3. Finally trying to get to the knight, but after knight, bishop c2 check, takes on c2, takes on c2, take on b3, and something like rook g6, this should be a draw. So usually rook and outside passed pawn are more or less equal to two light pieces. So really strange line, but an amazing one that you wouldn't expect in such an endgame. So no need to know all this. I just showed it because it was a nice discovery I wanted to share. And in fact, bishop d6 is much simpler. Now black wants to take, and then castle, and when everything is safe. So bishop g5, and now just drop back, break the pin, even though nothing wrong with h6, takes on f6, queen f6, this is also fine. So bishop e7 breaks the pin and threatens knight d5 when the bishop is attacked, and if bishop e7, knight e7 would win a piece. So bishop f6, and let's say f4. Knight c6, knight f3, and now simplest is just maybe just plant the bishop on d4, and both sides have outposts, and black really has nothing to worry about, just a complex middle game position with equal chances. So that's why bishop d5 in this position is a bit more critical, but I again wouldn't say it's too much. So e d5 is actually the line you need to know. That's the third line you need to know. And now bear in mind that the move bishop d6 would be exactly the same as in the line with knight f3, just that the knight is on c3, not on f3. But this makes a big difference, and that makes the move bishop d6 a mistake, because queen e2 check, queen e7, knight b5 is already problematic for black, and this gives white an advantage. This is the moment where the difference is made, and black's only move is the move a6. So with the knight on c3, it's very also simple to remember. Knight on c3, there are knight b5 ideas, so black takes care of the knight b5 ideas as soon as possible. So by playing the move a6, that's the only move for black in this position. So now the secret in this line for white is that he should try to get away without the move a4. But this is impossible to understand for the player who hasn't looked at this line in some depth from white's perspective. The automatic response I would expect by many players would be when they see a6 to play a4 immediately, just to stop any further b5. But this is exactly what black wants, as it gives him a free tempo to continue development and thus obtain easy play. So a4, not a good move. Bishop d6, black is fine already. And just to show you, queen e2, queen e7, for example, take on e7, king e7, knight g2, rook e8, castles, knight b7, endgame is problem free. King drops back, there is knight e5, the bishop can come out, and no problems whatsoever. So a4 is something that white should try to make without, but again, this is not that easy to understand for a surprised player or player who hasn't looked at this line. But we will imagine we are playing with a super strong player against a super strong player who has looked at this, understood all the subtleties, and plays the best move, knight f3. So we go bishop d6, and now again the most critical move for white is the move queen e2 check. The reason for this is that after castles, the middle game is actually quite fine for black. This is already very similar to the Tank Carlsen game that we looked at. The difference being that black was forced to make this move a6, but it can also come in handy. Now, if allowed, black will play h6 to stop bishop g5, so we should check bishop g5, h6, yeah, chasing away the bishop h4, and now just rook e8. Normal development. Yeah, bishop wants to go to f5, knight b7, bishop f5 immediately is also fine. Let's say rook e1, queen e1, and now just get rid of the pin. g5, bishop g3, bishop f5, and black is fine. Yeah, the bishops will be exchanged. Knight b d7 can come, b5 at some point. It's fine for black. That is why queen e2 should be played, queen e7, and only now castles. Queen takes e2, bishop takes e2, short castle. And now again, a very important move for white if he wants to fight for an advantage, that is move knight d2. Not an easy move. Again, you will see, for example, bishop e3, b5, already black is great. Similarly, a4, a move white should try to avoid, gives black a tempo, knight b d7. Rook d1, let's say, rook e8, h3, b6. It's already fine for black. Yeah, there are ideas like knight e5 or bishop e5, bishop c3, for example. Yeah, bishop b7 can attack that pawn, and black is doing fine in the endgame. That is why the best move is knight d2. So you see, it's not very easy for white to play this line in order to pose any practical problems to black. So knight d2, and this is the last moment where of some importance in the opening, as black has a choice. Again, I will give you one amazing line, which is again sacrificial and kind of unexpected, and then again I will also give you the simpler solution without any of these complications. So let's start with the crazy line, bishop e5. Yeah, makes sense because knight f3 just left the control over the e5 square, so bishop e5 threatening bishop c3 and knight d5. Knight c4 hitting the bishop, but also threatening knight b6. Now bishop c3. And now the automatic move would be bc3, which we will look at, but I wanted to show you the amazing line knight b6, attacking the rook. Bishop a5, knight takes a8, and bishop f5. So black is an exchange down, but again obtains fantastic counterplay thanks to these very, very active pieces. So the line is again semi-forced. Yeah. So d6 now, trying to extract the knight. Knight c6. This allows knight c6, and then knight d4. The pawn no longer controls c6. Knight c7, knight d4, attacking the bishop. Bishop f3 takes on f3, gf3, rook d8, going after the pawn. So thanks to these bishops and the fantastic activity, black has good compensation. The line continues. Bishop f4, defending the pawn. Knight h5, attacking the bishop. Knight g3, bishop g3, takes on g3, takes on d6. So white now, the knight on c7 is hanging. White needs to find the very difficult move, rook c1, intending rook c5 with a double attack on the bishops if bishop c7. So b6, defending the pawn. Now knight a6. Again, just an exchange, but now bishop d2. Now the bishops develop really great activity. The rook is attacked. Rook c4, bishop d3, skewer, rook a4 only move, and now h5. And a very curious position arises where the knight on a6 is offside, the rook is offside, the rook cannot get in on a1, cannot get into the game because rook d1, bishop c2 wins one of the rooks. The king cannot easily get into the game, and white is really like almost paralyzed, and black actually is objectively very fine here. So very strange line, yeah, but again a nice discovery that I wanted to share. So we go back and let's just check the move bc3, and now knight bd7, covering the b6 square, threatening b5, and also threatening knight d5. So knight e3 defends the pawn, and now b5. And again, plays simple. Knight b6, bishop b7, attack the d5 pawn, activate the queenside majority. After c4, the game can easily peter out. Knight b6, continuing the attack in the center, cb5, ab5, bishop b5, bishop a6. Attacking the bishop, and black will regain the pawn because after bishop a6, rook a6, white cannot activate easily the rook, and in fact cannot defend the pawn on d5. Rook d1, rook d8. Black regains the pawn with an equal endgame. So this is the more complex solution. Yeah. But okay, I mean, complex or not, it's for you to judge, because I think the simpler one is bishop c7. as now knight c4 runs into b5, and the bishop on c7 controls the b6 square. So white should go knight d4, knight e4, knight e4, now b6, defending the pawn and maybe threatening bishop b7 to attack the pawn on d5. I say simpler solution because it doesn't really depend so much on forcing lines. Yeah, so it's easier. You can just play it basing like using common sense. It's also a kind of sharp position, sharp endgame. d6, bishop d8, as white has this very strong pawn on d6, but again it's an isolated one, and as you will see, black manages to untangle and develop, and this long term white runs the risk of actually losing that pawn on d6 and ending up a pawn down. So again, an illustrative line, let's say bishop e3, knight c6, rook fd1, rook a7, rook ac1, and bishop e6. And again, black is untangling. Yeah, the rook can come to d7, maybe h6 to cover g5, maybe f5, bishop f6, rook fd8, and black still has the queenside majority that for the time being is not moving forward, but it's a possibility, long-term possibility, and if black just manages to kind of develop in this way, white can easily end up losing that pawn on d6 and ending up a pawn down. Objectively, it's quite an unclear endgame. And with this, we just conclude the analysis of the Queen's Gambit decline. This was the third line you needed to know. I went a bit more into detail, just to give you a more complete repertoire. But as I pointed out during the video, a lot of these lines you don't really need to remember or know. They were just more for informative value. As I said, 3 lines, yeah? 2 in the e3, knight f3, e3 line, 1 against e4, and that's pretty much about it. The good aspect, I think, is that the critical lines in the both e3 and e4 lines are these positions where white has a pawn on d5, isolated but passed pawn, and play can actually be very similar. So that wraps up the first video in the Simplified series. I hope you liked it. I'll do my Nakamura now. Make sure you smash that subscribe button. And yeah, tell me in the comments if you liked it. You can see also the links to my Chessable courses in the video description. Check the Simplified series on Chessable as well. I've done quite a few of them. And let me know what you think. Yeah, so I'm expecting your comments and opinions. So longer video than expected, but well, let's kick off the series in style. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!